There are many cosmological arguments out there, but I want to address one of Thomas Aquinas' today, the argument from motion. Thomas Aquinas was one of the greatest theologians and philosophers to have ever lived. He was not only prolific, but broke new ground. But he also stood on the shoulders of ancient Greek giants of philosophy, and in turn, theologians since have stood on his. Aquinas tried valiantly to implement a form of logos, a pattern of argumentation, to make a series of points understandable for the common man at the time, to prove definitively that God must exist, based on inferences made about the world around him. This is an argument against what you might call simple atheism, and less an argument for the exact properties of the Christian God. The reason this is particularly valiant as an attempt is that it is generally agreed by classical theistic Christians at least, that God exists beyond the physical, natural world. By virtue of having come from the human mind, all forms of rationalism and logical argument are also limited to the physical, natural world and metaphors based upon it, compounded by the fact that we are physical, natural beings with physical, natural brains. Arguing for God's existence with philosophical or physical evidence is therefore limited in how holistic an explanation of God it can even start trying to provide as a line of thinking. However, that doesn't mean we should just give up, or that there is nothing useful we can say on the subject. So, what is this valiant cosmological argument we've heard so much about? Aquinas had 5 cosmological proofs, 5 ways, for arguing the existence of God. The first way is the argument from motion, which is what we're talking about today. A side note explaining Aquinas' thinking before I begin. Go to the timestamp on the screen now to skip this. It will be easier for illustrative purposes as we are introduced to this argument to imagine this motion, as he calls it, as kinetic mechanical motion. Think pool balls hitting each other. However, Aquinas was an Aristotelian through and through, and he uses motion to refer not just to a transfer of kinetic energy, but also to the transition of something from potentiality to actuality. Phenomena like will and reason are considered potential. Outward expression of these are actual. This is what Aquinas calls actuations or operations throughout his Summa Theologica works. This echoes Aristotle's second volume of De Anima, in which actuations or operations are, and I quote, a preservation of that which is potential by something actual which is like it. This isn't the same as a transient alteration though, which is the destruction of something by its contrary, like the displacement of one of our pool balls by another. But this is all fluff as far as Aquinas' intentions go when he wrote the 5 ways, though it is important to know if we're going to deeply criticize or praise Aquinas' work, including the argument from motion. In his surface level explanation, bearing in mind that the 5 ways were designed for the ordinary man of the 13th century, he does mean physical change or physical motion, but the so-called transient alterations also include, say, chain reactions that lead to a change of physical state, like a change of colour. Consider redshift. You see a star in the night sky that's kind of reddish. This is because the star is moving away from you, and the wave frequency of the light coming to you from it is reduced, making it appear more reddish to you. A chain of reactions led to the star moving away from you. This literal kinetic motion is one transient alteration. The effect of the star's literal kinetic motion on the light that reaches you is another transient alteration. Shove that all in your pocket for now. The argument goes like this. Every motion was caused by something, some form of object A acting on object B. Nothing can put itself into motion. By extension, this means the universe must be finite. There must, by necessity, be an ultimate object A that instigated the first motion, the chicken to innumerable generations of eggs. It cannot be an infinite chain of cause and effect, or else we would be unable to explain why we see any motion at all. Say you imagine a circular, self-sustaining chain of cause and effect looping back on itself, like a circular Newton's cradle. Something began that first motion. Something has to have begun that first motion, else it would just be a static loop sitting and looking pretty. There is always a point at which no motion is happening, an event, and then a consequent state of things being in motion. This is why infinite regression, the act of trying to look back through an infinite number of motions to try to discern the one that began it all, and of course not finding one, can be tossed aside as a non-problem. So there must have been a first cause. Great. Now what? Well, if infinite regression is off the table, we know that this first cause, the root of it all, must be uncaused. It cannot have been put into motion by something acting upon it, else it wouldn't be the first cause. So if nothing is acting on this first cause, and motion is caused by something acting upon something else, then the first cause isn't in motion at all. It is the unmoved mover. It acts upon other objects and forces, but nothing acts upon it. This, Aquinas posits, is God. He is the only possible candidate for the role of the unmoved mover. And not only is God the first cause, but he also exists across the whole fabric of time, meaning that he exists simultaneously and with all effects, in Aquinas' words, meaning the unmoved mover is eternal as well as unchanging, i.e. unmovable. The only one who fits this bill is, again, God. Thomas Aquinas is thinking about God and, well, everything we know him to have been thinking about comes from a very Hellenistic frame of mind. His arguments rely upon taking as a given some of the ancient Greek ideas of what it is to be, and of what the universe is. I won't touch on that in too much detail here. By extension then, any problems that apply to this ancient Greek way of thinking about the existential are going to apply to Aquinas as well, in both a scientific and a philosophical sense. But let's talk about the strengths of this argument first. This holds up as a logical argument for there being a first cause, and that makes sense. In building these arguments, Aquinas tried to fulfill the principle of sufficient reason. That is, that there must be a sufficient explanation for everything with no caveats, no unexplained facts in the context of the argument. It must be holistic for its purposes. Some may criticize Aquinas for allegedly conflating the first cause and God, but if God is our creator, then yes, this argument from motion isn't a complete proof of every trait of his, but it does importantly address there being a creator to begin with, and not just a creator, but an eternal, unchanging creator, thinking back to what Aquinas took motion to mean. And that lines up with God. A common quip back is, if everything has a cause, what caused the first cause? Well, Aquinas has already answered this by explaining how an infinite chain doesn't make sense, and doesn't line up with the reality of there being a universe at all. So again, within his own framework, this holds up, and this isn't really an issue. However, there are a few valid criticisms. For one, why can't the first cause be the universe itself? This argument still works if the first cause is the universe, continually expanding, contracting, the Big Bang occurring, all in one endless loop. The first cause is extricable from God, and if you view the first cause as the universe, you can also go down the route of saying that God as a concept is just a cognitive or linguistic vehicle for making it easier for us as humans, even in this post-Big Bang Theory era, to talk about this first cause, which is not what Aquinas was trying to say. Expanding on this further, we find another problem. Why must there always be a cause from a third party? The motion we see in the world today is explained by transfers of energy. Those are not neat consecutive chains of effects. We also know today, with our modern understanding of physics, that all forms of physical motion and changes of state are caused by four forces: weak and strong nuclear forces, gravity, and the electromagnetic. This is where Aquinas' understanding of the universe, very much based on the ancient Greek, does him a disservice in this argument. Not all forms of motion, as Aquinas understands them, are caused by one separate body acting upon another. Consider nuclear fission, where the dissolution of a strong nuclear bond releases an enormous amount of energy. This itself isn't one body acting on another. Even if another body causes the dissolution of the nuclear bond, it is the dissolution of the nuclear bond, which is a force, not a body of its own, that causes the subsequent explosive reaction. There is a disconnect here. While there is a per se effect of two bodies on each other here, no cause and effect chain is causing the properties of both bodies. In fact, nuclear fission, gravity, etc., when we observe these forces, we are seeing the end stage of a per accidens string of events that form the bodies upon which these forces act. The counter-argument to this, a la Joseph Owens, is that the four forces themselves are sustaining causes, and we still require a first necessary cause, which can be God. A word of caution here though on both praising and refuting the argument from motion. These cosmological arguments are not called the five ways for nothing. Although they can absolutely stand alone, they are meant to be used together. No single one of them, including the argument from motion, is intended as the perfected sole possible proof for God ever. Else Aquinas wouldn't have bothered writing any more of them. Of course, this doesn't detract from criticizing the argument. So, how to summarize? Aquinas' argument from motion, the first of his 5 ways, does what it says on the tin. It explains that every form of motion or physical change is caused by something else acting upon it, and that there has to have been a first something with certain properties that only fit God, and therefore we have an argument for simple theism from motion. However, our modern scientific understanding does undermine the framework of thinking on which Aquinas built this argument. This means that the argument from motion rests on an inherently flawed understanding of physical cause and effect. The argument can still stand in the face of this, but not as it is, not in Aquinas' form. I will say this though, in a rationalist society like ours, it is a knee-jerk reaction to brand as worthless anything that contains the unscientific, or just the scientifically wrong. Much like Blaise Pascal, whose wager I criticise in this video, I also wrongly call him an atheist, oops, Aquinas here was setting out to encourage the ordinary man of his day to think. And look at us, almost 800 years later, still thinking about this, even if its foundations are unscientific. That's one aim achieved, and an important one. Aquinas' argument from motion may not stand the test of time, and may be debunked, but it is still worth our respect and our time personally today. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and be sure to check out the rest of my channel. God bless!